Welcome to episode 26 of the Thoughts with Lakshman podcast. My name is Lakshman Sybil, and I'm a junior in the Edgemont Junior Senior High School. And I have two main series that I'm uploading on my YouTube channel. I have my podcast, and I have my Learning German series. If you're interested, this is the podcast, by the way, but if you're interested in learning German as a foreign language, you can check out my videos. I have 31 episodes in that series. So yeah, check that out. Um, Obviously, my podcast is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Um, I've focused in the beginning in German culture, a bit on German history, and now we're going into more broader cultural topics, and we're going to start doing an anthropological series on an important issue. But yeah, let's get into the podcast. So, in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the development of different accents and dialects. Obviously, we have different languages in the world. Many people speak many different languages, and many people pronounce those languages uh, really differently. And it's fascinating to think that we're all human beings, um, and yet we all pronounce things very differently. And how did that happen? Over time, how did we evolve so that people in certain regions pronounce stuff differently than people in another region? I think that's very interesting. Um, so that's really what we're going to be trying to answer today in the podcast. So just to start, right? All social animals communicate with each other, from bees and ants to whales and apes, but only humans have developed a language which is more than a set of prearranged signals. Our speech even differs in a physical way from the communication of other animals. It comes from cortical speech center, which does not respond instinctively, but organizes sound and meaning on a rational basis. And this section of the brain is unique to humans, and that's why we can do such a thing. We can have such a language. When and how the special talent of language um, development is really impossible to say, but it's generally assumed that its evolution was a long process. And our ancestors were probably speaking a million years ago, but with a slower delivery and a smaller vocabulary, and above all, a simpler grammar structure than what we're accustomed to. The origins of human language will perhaps remain forever obscure. Um, and on the other hand, the origin of individual languages has been the subject of a very precise study over the past 2 centuries. There are about 5,000 languages spoken in the world today. A third of them, by the way, are in Africa. But scholars group them together really into a few families, around 20 families, and languages that are linked to each other, by shared words or grammatical constructions are put together in a family. And the theory is that, the members of each linguistic group have actually descended from one language, a common ancestor. And in many cases, that original language is judged, by the experts to have really been spoken in surprisingly recent times, in as little as a few thousand years ago. Obviously, the most widespread group of group of languages today, is the Indo-European, which is spoken by half of the world's population. This entire group ranges from Hindi and Persian to Norwegian and English. And it's really believed to descend from the language of a tribe of nomads roaming the plains of Eastern Europe and Western Asia, which today would be Ukraine. And this was as recent as 3000 BC, reced's backwards. So, for about 2000 BC, people speaking Indo European languages began to spread through Europe. And eventually they reached, the Atlantic coast and the northern shores of the Mediterranean. And they also penetrate far into Asia, occupying the Iranian plateau and much of India. Um, Another linguistic group of great significance in the early history of West Asia and still of great importance today is the Semitic family of languages. These are also believed to derive from the language of just one tribal group, possibly nomads in southern Arabia. By about 3000 BC, Semitic languages were spoken over a large tract of desert territory from southern Arabia to the north of Syria. And several Semitic peoples actually played a prominent role in the early civilization of the region. From the Babylonians and the Assyrians to the Hebrews and the Phoenicians. And one Semitic language, Aramic, actually became the focus, or the lingua franca, the main language of the Middle East for a long time. It's important to keep in mind, though, that a shared linguistic family does not imply any racial link. Though in modern times this distinction has really been blurred. Within the Indo-European family, for example, there was a smaller Indo-Iranian group of language, which are spoken from Persia to India, and um, the Aryans. It's also known as the Aryans. They're essentially linguistic rather than a genetic family. And the same is true of the Semitic family, including two groups which have really played a major part in human history, the Jews and the Arabs. On a linguistic map of the world, most of the great language families, occupy one distinct and self-contained territory. The two exceptions are, the Indo-European and the Finno-Ugric groups. But in modern times, the Indo-European languages have spread across the globe, to North and South America, Australia, and New Zealand, and that's really as a result of European colonialism. But really, the intermingling of Indo-European and Finno-Ugric that formed the patchwork quilt across Europe, and that's come about for a different and earlier reason. Um, Finland, together with Estonia on the opposite shore of the Baltic, forms one isolated pocket of the Finno-Ugric group. Hungary is another. And the cause of this wide separation is the Great Plateau of Europe, which Finno-Ugric and Indo-European tribes have shared and fought over through the centuries. The ancestral language of the Finns, Estonians, and Hungarians was actually once spoken in a compact region between the Baltic and the Ural Mountains until these people were scattered by Indo-European pressure, which is pretty interesting to think about that, given current. Um, Over the course of history, languages continue to infiltrate each other. As words are separated by conquest, empire, trade, religion, technology, or even in modern times, global entertainment. A great example of this process is the line in Western Europe dividing the Romantic languages from the Germanic languages. The Romantic languages are Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian. And the Germanic group is English, Dutch, Flemish, German, Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, and Icelandic. And that's why, for example, English is more similar to German, Spanish and Portuguese are more similar, and Italian. That's why it's easier once you know one of those. Like if you know how to speak Spanish, you'll be able to learn Portuguese much easier than someone who's German and can speak English. And this linguistic division, exactly reflects the influence of the Roman Empire. Italy, France, and the peninsula of Spain were sufficiently stable regions in the Roman world to retain, the influence of Latin after the collapse of the empire. And the Germanic areas east and north of the Rhine were never fully brought under Roman control. Um, and England was safely within the empire for 3 centuries, but the Romanized Celts were not strong enough to really resist the invading German tribes, the Angles and the Saxons, and their language prevailed in the form of Anglo-Saxon. Modern English occupies a middle position within, the Western European family of languages, with its vocabulary approximately half Germanic and half Romance in origin. But the reason, is not Britannia's fragile position within the Roman Empire. The cause is more recent in the Norman conquest. After seizing northwest France and adopting the local language, The Normans actually arrived in England with French as an essential part of their cultural baggage, and several centuries of rule by Norman aristocrats and bureaucrats bring Latin words back into the language of England through the medium of medieval French. Additionally, the ongoing struggle between languages is a process very similar to evolution, really. A word, like a gene, will travel and prevail according to its usefulness. A word's fitness to survive may derive from being attached to a desirable new invention or substance, or simply from being an amusing or useful concept. Aspirin, which was coined in 1899 by its German inventor, immediately became an international word. You know, snob, which is an English word, it's actually very common across many languages. That's obviously not a positive word, but as with evolution, the development of language is really an irresistible force. Through though traditionalists invariably attempt to build barriers against change, against that, but the useful word hopefully, um, hoffentlich in German, it means to be hoped that, has in recent years been steamrolled into the English language by the public, against howls of protest from the purists. On a grander scale, the French government from time to time legislates ineffectually against English word straying into French. These are the hybrids described as franglais. A good example of, this is their enticing notice on a tweed jacket seen in a Parisian shop window. Très snob, very snob. Well, that's what that means. And the French neurosis, about being tainted by English, though the intrusion is trivial compared to the overwhelming effect of Norman French on English in the past, is linked to a wider aspect of the evolutionary struggle between languages. A major advantage for any language is to become a lingua franca, which basically means like a dominant, main, powerful language. And, almost invariably, the result of power and prestige, the status, was achieved by the French after the heyday of France's international influence under King Louis XIV. In more recent times, first through the British Empire, but more significantly through American world dominance in the 20th century, English has really replaced the French in this role. But it's important to keep that in mind. So basically, history is closely tied to language learning. Additionally, English in the late 20th century was really in a fortunate position of being the lingua franca at a time in history right after World War. Um, but for the first time, in history, a global language was needed for practical purposes, by scientists, by airline pilots, and a communication system was in place to spread knowledge of the English language to a mass international audience through radio, television, and the internet. And the imperial power underpinning, American English as a lingua franca is really for the first time cultural and economic rather than, military. But it's very important to keep that in mind. Like one of the reasons English is so dominant is that at that time period they happen to be in lingua franca, and because of new developments, new technology, people needed to be able to communicate with others. It was much, much more important than in the past, and that's why they were forced to learn English. And that's very interesting. Maybe French would have been like that if it happened years before, or during the British Empire. Okay, it would have been English too, but it's an interesting thing to think about. Chinese. That's another example. But China hasn't been maybe in the future, but China hasn't been that dominant in the past. But Chinese is actually spoken by more people than English, be it in one region of the world. But Chinese economic power lies in the future. But the complexity of Chinese perhaps makes it an unlikely rival candidate. One of the great advantages of English is that it's very easy to speak at a simple level, though very complex at a very advanced level. You know, as the evolutionary processes go on, there are many varieties of English in use. You've got English flourishing in New Guinea, could be baffling to an outsider. It was actually originally devised as a practical business language, reduced to its simplest elements, and it really has evolved in its own, rich character. In the same way, English-speaking communities in the West Indies or in India have also developed local words, phrases, and constructions which give their own version of the language a special color. And the astonishing proliferation of Indo-European languages from one tongue to another just 5,000 years ago will not be repeated in our more interconnected world. But the tendency of language to continue to evolve truly remains unchecked. Um, Additionally, the dialect of New Orleans is largely attributable to the many different nationalities that developed the area. The French, Irish, African American, and other European influences can all be heard, within that city. Um, and that plays a big role, across many different American cities and American regions. The people who, the European immigrants that came over to live in those areas, plays a big role in the dialects that we hear today. For example, when you think of Southern accents, when you think of New York accents, and all sorts of things, it plays a big role. Additionally, when the Spanish colonized South America and Mexico, that's why South America speaks Spanish. And the reason Brazil speaks Portuguese is because Portugal, in that deal that they made with Spain, they signed a treaty in the mid 1600s because they were the two top countries in the world in terms of recognizing that, discovering the New World and recognizing that it was very valuable. They made a deal, and Portugal actually got Brazil. And Portugal conquered Brazil, and they dominated it for many years, and that's why Portuguese is spoken in Brazil. Whereas across the rest of South America, you speak Spanish. So the history really plays a big role. For example, um, in other languages, for example, British English, right? That's slightly different than American English, but similar. But British English, that sort of English is more common in Australia and New Zealand. That's because the British Empire had power there. Um, and that's another thing. For example, when you spell color, in the US, you'd spell color Color, right? But in England, you spell color Colour. In Australia, you'd spell color Colour. That's because of the British Empire. So that's another interesting thing to keep note of. But yeah, I hope that you enjoyed the podcast. This is quite an interesting episode. Um, you would not expect, at least, when you're starting off, you wouldn't expect all this stuff, but in terms of English, um, and the development of languages, you don't think much of it normally. And it's fascinating once you dig deep into it and you really start to understand how all sorts of different languages actually developed. And I don't know, I think that's fascinating. And I hope that some of the examples I've provided, you hope that you found them useful. Um, but yeah, thank you for listening to the podcast. I hope, again, that it was useful for you. I hope that you were interested in the topic. Maybe you do more research now. But yeah, thank you and goodbye.